We are a local affiliate of about 75 organizations across the country. So we really serve the St. Louis metro area. We do work though across the state. We are the only affiliate in Missouri and Illinois. So we sometimes cross over into the Illinois side and do various presentations. Our agency's mission is around preventing and reducing the harms associated with alcohol and other drugs. So we do that through a variety of ways. One, and probably what we're most known for locally, is a lot of our prevention services. We offer school-based prevention lessons, grades K through 12. So we are in about 260 schools serving over 70,000 young people each year. And it looks different ways in different districts for different kids at different age levels. We're not in kindergarten classrooms talking about heroin or even any other drug. We're doing kindergarten classrooms talking about how to be a good friend and how to use teddy bear words instead of porcupine words, and that, you know, the character building and those resiliency skills that everybody needs, because at some point life stinks, and so how do you handle it? How do you deal with it? So we work to provide that prevention resiliency skill education up through about 4th, 5th grade, and then we start on more drug-specific lessons. Additionally, our agency does a lot of public awareness and education at large in the community with all things related to substance use, whether that's various professional development for organizations, seminars, workshops, professional networking opportunities, public awareness campaigns and ads, and we do have a small counseling department. So we don't offer treatment, we're not a treatment agency, but we have counselors on staff that do substance use assessments and referrals. And most recently, I know that we'll talk some more this morning too about the opioid epidemic, but obviously since about 2007-8, that's something we've been paying a lot of attention to, a lot of focus, especially in the St. Louis region for Missouri, has been around opioids, prescription painkillers, heroin, and so we have done a lot of work to raise awareness, educate the community, and then also do some overdose education and naloxone distribution.
What drug causes the most damage?
What drug causes the most damage? What a loaded question. So the drug that somebody's addicted to is the answer that we typically get.
And as far as justice goes, alcohol is the number one.
Right. Well, alcohol is the number one misused substance, but you know, we often get this question. We get the question from parents, from adults, from teenagers themselves, asking which drug is the most dangerous. Well, if you suffer from a substance use disorder, it's the drug that you're addicted to is the most dangerous. So that really varies. So I'm going to kind of run through this, and again, I didn't know exactly what we were looking for here. I mean, I know what I was asked to present on substance use, what is substance use disorder. So if this is like, yeah, I already know, like, you can give me the speed up sign, or we can spend more time on areas. I'm very, very flexible in this. So one of our agency's work and mission and goals is really just elevating the conversation around substance use disorder, this disease of addiction. What is it? What does it mean? Why does it happen to some people and not other people? And how is it defined as a brain disease? That we understand addiction not as a matter of willpower, not necessarily a choice, that once the brain has changed, once something has happened in an individual, that we're looking at it and treating it like a disease, just like other diseases. So the American Medical Association, when they look at any type of disease, looks at kind of these 3 categories. If a disease, if something that's happening medically to an individual has symptoms, progression, and a prognosis, it meets those core basic criteria to be defined as a disease. Addiction meets these things as well. And so when we're looking at this, there are definite symptoms. There's behavior changes, there's physical changes that happen as an individual continues to use substances. We know that this is a progressive disease, that there's various stages, that we go through different cycles of the disease of addiction. And we also know the prognosis, that if somebody continues to use and they become addicted, it can be a very chronic disease and also a very fatal disease for a lot of people. I also want to clarify that when we're talking about substance use disorder, we're talking about people kind of all the way on that far right side of the arrow. Our agency is not about prohibition. It's not that we say that people should have no use. In fact, when we're talking even with young people, we're talking about what's happening to somebody as they use substances, how that impacts their body and brain. And so for many people, there is a decision of non-use. And that's a healthy decision, and that we support. intended by the doctor. That's illegal use. Any substance use is putting anything into our body that changes the way we think, act, or feel. If anyone has had coffee today, or a caffeinated beverage, you have used a substance, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that you suffer from this disease of addiction. It doesn't mean that's the type of thing we're talking about. So the misuse, then, when we start to get into that category, is really the illegal use beyond intended, so consuming alcohol in large amounts and to the point of intoxication, using prescription medications more frequently or not as intended by the doctor, or when something causes harm. So we look into that misuse category of if something is harming an individual, and that can be emotionally, physically, in their relationships, in their daily lives. If harm is being caused, then we start to kind of cross into that gray area of misuse. And then addiction or substance use disorder is when we see a fundamental brain change. And that's what we really are talking about today when we're talking about substance use disorders. So I'll talk a lot about the brain. I don't claim to be a neuroscientist. I don't claim to know everything about the brain, but we have educated our staff enough to know what's happening in the brain related to substance use disorders, and that's really what we like to share, what we like to talk about in understanding addiction as this brain disease. So here's really a standard definition, and as clinicians, as either people that are working in prevention or treatment fields, or people that are going into prisons and jails and working with folks that might be struggling with addiction themselves, of course we're not going to have brain scanners in our back pockets. We're not going to be able to see some of this brain change that's happening. But how we start to recognize it is really in the first part of this definition, of that continued use despite negative consequences. So negative consequences are things like they're in jail or prison, right? Or they're having relationship difficulties, or trouble at school or work, or other mental health concerns, or problems in relationships with spouses, with parents, with friends. So we're looking at all of these things around harmful consequences or negative consequences. So as someone continues to experience these consequences related to substance use, but are not able to stop using the substance, those are the behavior changes. Those are the things that trigger us to know that something has probably happened here in this individual's brain. That this is beyond something that is controlled from just a willpower or decision they're making. That their brain is craving these substances. Their brain has hijacked the reward center of their brain, of their body, of their brain, and is controlling these choices they make. So it's that change in brain structure, again, that we define it as a substance use disorder. So what does that mean? What's happening in the brain? So it all boils down to dopamine, to simplify things here. So dopamine is our feel-good chemical in our brain. We all get dopamine. We get dopamine when we're doing our favorite activities. We get dopamine when we see friends at conferences that we haven't connected with in a while. We have dopamine when we spend time with our spouses or our loved ones. We get dopamine when we eat our favorite meals. We get dopamine releases from all kinds of things that make us feel good. And that's why, as human beings, we do things that our brains respond to us feeling happy, to feeling good, to feeling pleasure. And what happens when an individual uses substances is that there's an artificial release of dopamine into the brain. It floods the brain with dopamine, which is why initially, when people use substances, it feels really good. It's taking away whatever harm or pain or discomfort or just unhappiness they might be feeling, because there is an initial flood of dopamine and it feels really good. And the brain remembers that. And the brain's like, wow, yeah, that felt great, we should do that again. Now, for about 90% of the population, we also want to be kind of regulated. We like to be on an even keel. While things might feel good, we also know, like, that was a lot of feel good and that's not natural. That's not how I want to feel all the time. So maybe we are able to responsibly use alcohol and not feel the crave to use it every day. Maybe we're able to, at some point in our lives, we've used substances as we were rebellious teenagers or in college years, but then as responsibility and other things in life happened, we were able to move away from that. But it's on average, when we look across the population, about 10% of people, for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about in a little while, their brains are not able to necessarily kind of turn that off. Their brains are saying, whoa, all that dopamine was amazing. We should keep doing that. And so flood of dopamine, the brain adapts because it's not natural and it's not meant to occur in that way. So the brain adapts in a couple different ways. One is that it stops naturally producing some of its own dopamine. So when you see somebody suffering with a substance use disorder, and things that used to be giving them a lot of pleasure and joy in life, whether that's maybe that it was a young person who used to really be into sports and now they're like, I don't care. Or maybe it's a person that doesn't seem very bothered that now their marriage is failing or their job is no longer anything that's giving them satisfaction. It's because the brain has adapted and is stopping or lowering that production of dopamine naturally because this individual is getting it through a flood of substances. It's just like the brain becomes kind of lazy. And if you didn't have to show up to work ever, but you still got a paycheck every 2 weeks, most people would probably continue to do it, right? And so the brain's reacting in that same way. It doesn't have to do any of the work. It's not having to work to produce this dopamine because the drugs are doing it. And the individual is flooding their brain with dopamine from the drugs. The brain also starts to react to be able to handle this flood of dopamine by lessening its dopamine production and increasing dopamine receptors. So the brain almost starts to kind of form in a way to create more places for all this dopamine to go, or to block off certain places so that the dopamine's not having such an impact. So again, now we have an individual who is, that's where we have these terms around craving and needing it and hijacking the brain, because the brain is so strongly saying, I need more dopamine and I need it now. And the best and easiest way to get it is from these drugs you're getting. So keep doing those, I'm gonna keep doing this dopamine. And when it's not, then we get off even keel. And the brain is no longer really producing dopamine to get high or to feel this euphoric effect, but just to get back to feeling okay again. Just to feel normal, quote unquote, again. So dopamine levels. Let's take a look at what we're talking about here. So on the bottom, we have just a few categories that we'll look at. Across the top, we have our release of dopamine. So 0 is not that we have no dopamine. Everybody is producing dopamine at some level. It's usually between 0 and 100 is kind of folks' baseline of dopamine release in their brain. And then as we go up, we're looking at percentage of increase of dopamine. So we'll start with food, because I'm going to assume that everyone in here has experienced eating food in their lives. And you know that when you think about food and we think about eating, although it gives us lots of nutrients in all parts of our body, it also releases dopamine. It's one of the reasons that in a few hours you're saying, I should probably eat again. I like doing that. And so when we eat food, there's about 150% bump in dopamine in our brains. So we enjoy a meal, our brains react and are like, that felt good. We like that. It helps us survive as people, if nothing else. So let's start to look at some substances. Nicotine. People might have used nicotine yourselves in your life or know somebody else who has, and you know that it's often very difficult for people to stop using nicotine. Part of that reason is because of this bump in dopamine. Nicotine gives you about a 200% bump in dopamine in your brain. That's higher than food. To your brain, nicotine feels better. Looking at substances, when we look at cocaine, a little bit higher, right? We're into about 300% bump in dopamine here. Now we start thinking about the opioid epidemic and how and why it has kind of just derailed communities and lives, and why it's been so difficult to try to curb and so difficult to work at. We have to also consider this and what's happening in the brain for individuals who are using heroin or other opioids. It's a 2,200 time bump in dopamine. If you talk to somebody who's been using and you talk with them about their first time, 9 times out of 10, if not 10 out of 10, they'll describe it as the best feeling they've ever had. Nothing in their life had ever felt that good than the first time that they used heroin or misused another opioid. And it's because there is this flood of dopamine in their brain. You cannot get that naturally any other way. It doesn't happen. So it's that taking over of the brain and that flood of dopamine and the brain remembering, I want to feel that good again. And the brain also adapting really quick because it knows this isn't natural and I can't handle this on a regular basis. So why do people use opioids? And this is not just opioids, but other substances, but the researcher here, Alexander Wally, who has produced these slides that kind of simplify things for us, has done a lot of research around opioids. So if you he really characterizes this looking at opioids. But again, we're looking at what happens over time. How does the brain change? So here in the front part, we're looking at somebody that first starts to use. They're using and they're getting euphoria, they're getting high, they're getting that level of dopamine. Over time, as the brain starts to adjust and react, it's right in here that we see the formation of a substance use disorder, of a brain disease as we would define it. Where a person is no longer using, their brain has changed in a way that their dopamine levels are low, and anytime they're not using, they're experiencing withdrawal symptoms, they're experiencing falling below their normal, and now they begin to use just to feel okay again, just to be able to function at all. So it's no longer about that euphoric impact. It's now because the brain has taken over, or the reward center, the dopamine, the substance has taken over the brain. So I'm going to quickly flip through some brain scans, just to kind of take a look again at some of this brain stuff. So this is what we would call a typical brain. And you can see what we're looking at here. The colors are just the activity in the brain. So things that are happening, neurons that are firing, ways that the brain is reacting. So we know that substances impact the brain, and we know that it impacts the activity in the brain just from looking at brain scans. So for example, here's somebody who has used marijuana for about 10 years on the weekends, 28-year-old. We can see that there's a reduction in activity in the brain. Again, the brain starts to shut down certain areas. Not that it's dead, it doesn't mean that these areas are not doing anything. They're just lowering their activity as the brain is compensating for the use of the substance and for this reaction to dopamine. Alcohol, 22-year daily use for a 45-year-old. Cocaine, 2-year use for a 24-year-old. Heroin, 25-year use for a 39-year-old. And now we look, as we will shift here now to, well, what does that mean for people that we want to try to help, for people that we want to try to get out of this cycle of addiction, that we want to help recover from their disease? So a lot of the question we often get is, well, does the brain get better? How does that work? What happens? Well, the answer is yes, the brain can get better. Does it really get ever back to its typical or where it was before someone started using? Probably not. There's probably some significant damage that has been done over time. But it can get a lot better than when somebody's in active use or somebody's using even on, as we saw, a weekend basis. So there is a lot of recovery that can happen in the brain. Part of it, though, is that recovery process is slow. Just like for most substances, heroin, opioids might be the exception, but for most substances, it's a gradual process that someone develops a substance use disorder, someone develops a brain disease. And it typically will take quite a long time, usually at least 12 months before we start to see recovery in the brain. And so it doesn't mean that just because someone has stopped using, maybe they've stopped using because they want to enter into a treatment program. Maybe they've stopped using because they no longer have access to the drug. Maybe they've stopped using because they're incarcerated or in jail for some reason. And just that absence of substances is not necessarily going to change their behavior. It's not going to change their thought process around their disease because the brain is still injured. So we often talk to people and, family members, law enforcement, other people working with the people in recovery, and they're like, well, they haven't used for 3 months, but they're still just acting the same. They still aren't getting pleasure from things that, we used to really enjoy going out and going to dinner and going to the movies, and they don't even want to spend time with me, or they're still really not interested in this career that they had built before they started entering recovery. Well, that's because their brain is still healing. And that process can take up to 12 months to even start, depending on how long a person's been using, depending on what type of substance. So we have to be realistic about the expectations of someone who begin to seek recovery and treatment for their disease. We also have to accept that reoccurrence is a very real part of this disease. Just as, if we were friends, we had a loved one, someone we cared about, that was suffering from high blood pressure, hypertension. And we went out to lunch with them and they ordered, a large fry and a sandwich. We wouldn't sit there and say, I cannot believe you're doing that. You just ordered fries. Do you know what you're doing to yourself? Do you know what you're doing to me when by ordering that and eating those fries? I can't believe you're doing this. That's typically not the conversation that would be had. We might more gently say, fries. care. Why would you use it again? Well, it's all of these reasons. It's all of these reactions in the brain that are triggering their use again. Some of those are external, as it says. Maybe it's that there's a group of friends they've always used with, or every Friday when they got paid, that would be the time they'd go purchase drugs. So it just triggers that reaction in their brain. Or most people that are using substances are co-occurring with some other mental health disorders. So there's other things happening. So if those are not being addressed, if we have untreated depression, anxiety, just general not being able to deal with feelings in life or knowing how to do that, those can easily trigger that use of substance again. And so it's not, again, about weakness or just saying no thank you, it's about how the brain is reacting. And if we look at substance use disorder compared to most other diseases that we are more familiar with, the rates of reoccurrence are not very different. In fact, in some ways, they're lower than if we're looking at like hypertension or asthma. So again, just framing this idea of substance use disorder around brain disease and looking at it that way, we begin to see that we can treat it as a disease. We can treat it as a biological disease that's happening, but then also address the other social and emotional supports that an individual will need. So what puts someone at risk? Why do some people become more addicted than others? And these are some of the risk factors. These are the identified risk factors through the National Organization of SAMHSA that we work to address. And these are risk factors that play a part in prevention. So we want to try to decrease these risks from somebody even developing a substance use disorder. But as they're engaging in recovery and treatment, these are also some of the things we have to address. If these things go unaddressed, we're just setting a person up for more likelihood of reoccurrence. Any idea on this list what's kind of the number one risk factor?
Weak family relationships.
Good guess, but not there.
First outcomes.
The biggest risk factor, the number one risk factor, is early experimentation. So the younger a person starts using substances, the more likely they are to develop a substance use disorder. Now these are all risk factors, but that is the number one risk factor. And again, it comes down to that brain thing. Our brains are not fully developed until about our mid-20s. So that's why teenagers, for all the things that teenagers are, they're also able to pick up and learn things much faster than we are as adults. They're meant to. Their brains are still firing and wiring in ways that ours, we're way past that stage. And so our brains at that early age begin to form and learn substance use as well. So a lot of our prevention work is even just about delaying the age of onset, delaying the age of first use. If everyone in this country waited until the age of 21 at least, 25 would be great, to ever even use alcohol or ever engage in any substance, I wouldn't have a job right now. Our jails and prisons would probably be probably less than half as crowded as they currently are. Police officers, we need about half of them that we currently do, because we would have almost zero problem with this disease of substance use disorder and addiction. It wouldn't be happening. Now, it would still happen on a very low level, but the treatment resources and the other things we have in play would be able to more effectively help those people. But it's because we have, in the state of Missouri, we do surveys and we have researchers and epidemiologists that look at onset of substance use, and the average age of first use of alcohol is 12, and the average age of marijuana is 13. So when we're looking at young people, 12 and 13 as the average age of first initiation of use with alcohol or marijuana, we're just setting their brains up for a risk of addiction. So treatment options, when we look at what kind of options are available for people to treat substance use disorder, there has been a lot of conversation and a push throughout the country, specifically through federal funding, to elevate the use of medications for opioid use disorder as a tool, as a resource in the course of treatment. Again, it just kind of helps people get into that normal zone. The medications assist them to be able to function, so then they're able to maybe engage in other social supports, whether that's dealing with other mental health stress, whether that's dealing with employment or other functions in life that they'll need to be able to fully recover. But
Could you say more about the different treatment options?
For opioids?
Yes.
Yes, hold on, I got a slide that has a picture that explains it very well. So there is inpatient options, there are intensive and outpatient treatment programs for all substance And then really looking at those other holistic alternative approaches, knowing that for any disease, whether we're talking about diabetes and the use of insulin combined with healthy eating and exercise, we should be treating addiction in the same way, looking at how we can implement some standard treatment practices, but then what else needs to happen for this person. And those community supports can include support groups, faith-based organizations, finding that faith in their lives. Those community supports are just as important in many of these other things. These are all tools that someone will need. There is no one answer. There is no cookie cutter way that somebody will recover, that somebody will live successfully in recovery from substance use disorder. So we really have to take a look at the individual and what their needs are. I'm going to move fast here. So this slide just again has that same kind of chart that shows what medications do. They just knock someone into that normal zone. They just help them stay there. So there's really 3 main medications available for the use of opioid use disorders. And they're a little bit different. You probably have heard of all of them. The most common that has been around the longest is methadone. So what methadone is a full agonist. It locks into those opioid receptors in the brain. It fills them up, opioids can't get in there. It cuts the cravings, it cuts the person's desire to trigger their use. Yes.
Can you say more about methadone withdrawal?
Methadone is a drug?
Yes, the withdrawal from methadone.
Yes, so but methadone is an opioid. Because it's able to lock into those opioid receptors, it is an opioid. So when people continue to use methadone, there can be withdrawal from methadone, there can be diversion of methadone. People who are not in a regimented pattern of using methadone may experience some euphoria, a little bit. It's not going to be as much as painkiller or street heroin. But methadone activates that receptor in the brain. It locks in there and it activates that receptor. It is an opioid, but it will, yeah, go ahead.
So people I deal a lot with people that are withdrawing, and they report that withdrawing from methadone is far worse, it takes far longer than heroin.
Right, because it is fully occupying that receptor, and because they often have been on it for an extensive period of time. So more common, what has kind of become the latest recommendation in opioid use disorder treatment is the use of buprenorphine or Suboxone, which is more commonly known. So that's what we call a partial agonist. And that's the one here, in that it doesn't fully occupy that receptor, the mu receptor that activates the opioids, but it partially gets in there. So again, it just kind of helps stabilize the person. There can be withdrawal from Suboxone. It can be diverted and misused as well. But it allows individuals who are suffering with opioid use disorder to block some of those cravings, to reduce their kind of drive to find opioids. Another drug that's a lot used, at least locally, in the Department of Corrections and through jails and prisons is the use of Vivitrol. So Vivitrol is an opioid blocker. So this drug, naltrexone, is what it just, as the picture shows, it just blocks that receptor so that opioids can't get in there. It's typically given as a shot that's meant to last about a month. The downside here is that it doesn't last a month for everybody. Some people it's 22 days, some people it's 26 days. And so it's really hard to judge kind of how long it's going to work for a person. And with Vivitrol as well, you have to have a period of abstinence from opioids. With Suboxone and methadone, it could be delivered right away. We see it being delivered more in some places, in some programs, as somebody is arrested and goes to jail, or maybe after they suffer an overdose and enter into a emergency department.
The economics of those two drugs.
Right, so the economics. So methadone has to be given on a daily basis, and it can only be given through specific methadone clinics. So this creates a barrier for a lot of people. If you had to add an additional 3 hours of commuting to your day to be able to get to a clinic, take a medication that you need, and then get to work, school, life, that's a lot, right? I mean, I grumble when I have to sit in 20 minutes of traffic some days, much less adding all of another whole step into my day. So methadone can be very costly to that daily medication, and also add a lot of barrier as far as life and time. Buprenorphine or Suboxone, for most places, an initial dose will be given through that same type of clinic setting, although this medication can even be prescribed out of a primary care office. Physicians can be waivered and able to prescribe buprenorphine. Most physicians, most practices will have it set up that for about a week or two, you might need to come almost daily, maybe every other day, just to make sure the dosage gets regulated. And then there can be take-home prescriptions for various types of Suboxone or Subutex. And like,
is there a shift from the federal government to make that more available? Because right now, there's a huge shift away from anything that has to do with opioids. So doctors are under a lot of constraint as to, and it takes more of their time to do this. So is there a shift in trying to help the government balance all this out?
Yes and no. Some of the shift is by a flood of dollars, which resources are helpful, of course. Every state has what is called STR, State Targeted Response Dollars, or the next round of those that'll be coming in the fall are SOR, which are State Opioid Response Dollars. So these dollars are being used primarily for a lot of treatment resources, so offering treatment for the uninsured in places that people are not able to afford these medications or have access to them. They can now through these federal dollars. It's also helping to increase doctors who have the buprenorphine waiver. So doctors are often reluctant to get that because they don't understand it, because they don't have the education. You have to go through an 8-hour course to be waivered. So these funds are being used to provide doctors more incentive to become waivered. And then also looking at changing policy and practice around why do they have to be, they don't have to be waivered to prescribe hydrocodone. Why do they have to be waivered to prescribe a medication for somebody that is suffering from addiction from that drug? So there's a lot of policy push and policy work being done through those programs as well. And then the other, quickly, I know I'm talking a lot here. Quickly, I'm going to just say one more thing. Here, we'll just say it here. So one of the things I mentioned is work through NCADA that we're doing as part of what we call the MOHO project, and I know other states and other places are doing it as well, and that's increasing the availability of naloxone or Narcan. And this is the opioid overdose reversal drug. And so I know in some places across the country, especially on the east and west coast, this has been happening for a long time. We're a little slower with things sometimes in the Midwest, so we're getting there. So for about the last 2 years now, we've been really doing a push to prescribe more, or not prescribe, to make naloxone or Narcan more accessible to people. And that is particularly in jails and prisons to the general population, even having first responders, law enforcement, and others carrying Narcan. Because what this drug does is it essentially reverses an overdose. So thinking about those opioids occupying those receptors in the brain, Narcan comes in and kicks the opioids out. And so a person, as they're overdosing, their breathing stops is what happens. So they're able to start breathing again once they're administered Narcan and those opioids are knocked out of the receptor.
Well, it depends on how much they're on, too.
Right, it might take
Sometimes
a
they
little
have to
while.
administer it 2 or 3 times to.
Correct.
They're on the brink of death.
Correct.
And they can't breathe, right?
Right. So a person cannot administer Narcan to themselves because they're not breathing at this point. And so it's important for other people around them to have it. We talk a lot about even lay people having it because as overdoses increase, as opioids become more powerful. So we're really seeing this shift even from prescription medications to heroin now to more powerful opioids like fentanyl or carfentanil, which are just more powerful. They hold on to that receptor a lot stronger than other opioids. So it might take multiple doses of naloxone or Narcan to work. And so why this is important to know, and one, because people should be carrying and using or have availability of Narcan, especially working with populations that are at risk of overdose. But also understanding, again, just how opioids work and this addiction works for individuals, in that their tolerance drops very quickly. And so when we are seeing the skyrocketing number of overdoses, locally and across the country, I think the most recent results, so were just released that there were over 70,000 overdose deaths in the United States last year. And so as we're seeing this continued increase of overdose deaths across the country, if we really break those down, a large number of those are contributed to the powerful opioids, fentanyl particularly. But then the greatest population of people that are overdosing are people who have recently had a period of abstinence. And so these are people that might have been entering into a treatment program and then a reoccurrence occurred, right? Or more than not, common than not, it's people that have been in jails or prisons and then get out or get access to heroin in the jails or prisons. It can be as short as 2 days that somebody's tolerance can just drop. So we have an individual that is using heroin or other things, as I know you were mentioning before we started our presentation. Because of their use disorder, they are stealing to be able to support hundreds of dollars a day to access their drugs. They get caught, they're incarcerated or put in jail on a Friday night, say. Sunday morning they're released. They go out and they use the same amount from the same person. It's the exact same drug that they used on Friday, and now they use it on Sunday, and now it's a lethal dose because their tolerance has dropped that quick. And so when we are looking at Narcan and naloxone, there's also a lot of movement to make sure that people, as they're released from jails or prisons, that they're given doses of Narcan as well, and they're educated around recognizing the signs of an overdose, about if they go and use again, their tolerance has dropped, that they need to make sure they're with somebody else when they're using, so that if they do overdose, someone else can administer that Narcan, because otherwise they will stop breathing and die.
The first 2 guys that I had to administer Narcan to, I just had the one that would push in the nose.
Yeah, that's
and,
neat.
and both of the guys had nose rings in, so I couldn't get it in there.
Mhm.
So I lost both of them. So now I carry both the this kind and the
And iron.
EpiPen.
Yeah, Narcan is being made very available. So the Narcan is the nasal spray. That's the brand name for the nasal spray. Naloxone is the generic name. So the nasal spray will work for most people, except if there's some blockage in their nasal cavity or if they've used a large amount of opioids. There also is the intramuscular naloxone, which is you can just get in a little vial and use a syringe with. It's very easy to use. Some people are a little squirmish with needles, so it might not be your thing. But it's just, it can just be given through the muscle, so it's not like you have to get into a vein or anything like that. And then there are other products available to be able to use naloxone that are more like an EpiPen or like in a box that even talks to you and gives you instructions on how to do it. But those are often cost prohibitive. Those can run very high cost. The Narcan and the injectable IM naloxone are very cheap. So that's, I think, the summary of what I have around substance use disorder and heroin. So
Why don't we open up for questions for you? Because I'm fascinated with your expertise.
Oh, thank you.
So go ahead.
Okay, questions? Yeah.
Well, meth, there is no treatment. Isn't that one of the worst?
Well, meth, there is treatment. There's not medication.
No, I'm trying to make it, that's what I meant.
Yeah, there's no
I mean,
medication.
I'll leave it abstain for 2 or 3 years, but it takes forever.
Right, well, because it takes forever for that brain to recover. That's what it is. So it's that time for the brain to heal. So yeah, for meth there is, so the only substances that there's medications to assist with is opioids and alcohol. There are some medications that are actually Vivitrol, the one that's the blocker, that was first designed to assist with alcohol withdrawal and alcohol treatment and recovery. And then it was recognized that it was kind of working the same way with opioid receptors, so that's where it really became popular. But yeah, for stimulants, currently there are no medications. Although, science and research is catching up a lot in this disease, so hopefully we will see maybe some emergence of that. We also know while we've been paying a lot of attention to opioids, meth has not gone away, and we're actually seeing an increase in meth as well. So as we watch drug trends, I'd imagine in 5 years, we might finally start to get a handle on the opioid issue, but then we're just going to see the reappearance of meth stronger than ever. So.
Are your slides on the brain pictures available somewhere? I haven't had, but I'd love to show the one on marijuana use.
Yep, they're online.
Those brain scans are online, and I'd be happy, I can email my PowerPoint. I have one copy with me that I don't need,
You can access it online.
yeah, you can, if you just Google substance use brain scans, they're pretty common. Yeah.
When you talked about dopamine addiction, and you showed that graph, food caused 100 times, and nicotine 200, and cocaine, heroin, alcohol was not on that graph.
Correct.
Where would that fit?
Alcohol fits between nicotine and cocaine. So alcohol will give you a little bump in dopamine, not quite as high as cocaine or other stimulants, but more than nicotine.
Okay.
And again, it's not an exact science.
Approximate.
Right, individuals will react differently, and that's really looking at some of that initial use. So if you've been using alcohol every day for 20 years, you're probably not going to get that same release of dopamine alcohol. You will have a tolerance to those, yeah. Other questions, thoughts?
Narcan, that's not readily available, is it? I mean,
It depends where you live.
like Colorado, for instance.
Oh, in
I
Colorado,
went to
yeah.
the pharmacy and said, I'd like to have some Narcan.
Yes, in most states, and I'm like 90% sure Colorado is one of those states. In most states, because even Missouri, we have what we call standing orders for naloxone, meaning that you can get it over the counter. You can walk into any, well, not over the counter, but you can walk into any pharmacy and it's behind the counter and you can say, I'd like some naloxone or Narcan. And then you can purchase it. So you can purchase it out of pocket. For the nasal spray, you can purchase it out of pocket. It's typically for a box of 2 nasal spray doses, about $120. If you have insurance, the cost varies somewhat. Like I have pretty standard Anthem, Blue Cross, Blue Shield insurance. My insurance, if I walked into Walgreens, it would be $35 copay for it. For Missouri Medicaid, it's a $3 copay. So it's accessible in most places. And like I said, look up in your local states what your local states are doing with their STR or SOR funds, and that treatment and having medications for opioid use disorder are accessible for people that are uninsured, and there is a lot of Narcan distribution being done through those projects as well.
Could you say more about how drugs change the brain, but they also change your sense of identity and community?
Right, well, because that brain change is really also leading to a personality change. Because, not to simplify things too much, I mean, we teach our kids in schools that, you know, brains are the boss of our body. They control everything we do. They control our thoughts and our feelings and our emotions. And so as we start to see the brain change because of addiction, we're also seeing some of those other things change for people. And that is all part of what needs to happen in a comprehensive recovery for an individual. The brain needs to heal on a biological level, but then those other things that make us human beings and are part of our lives need to be reintroduced and relearned in some ways as well. So those can be those social supports, those feeling of belonging, those faith, all of those things that just are our basic needs too.
Well, do you have any advice for people who minister to addicts or family members? Because it's such a, trust is being misused, so you just want to lash out and walk away. How do you overcome that? Is there a pill for that?
I wish there was just an easy
Well, I'm
answer.
sure there's a Valium or something. But
What we go back to relying on this stuff a lot, because unfortunately people in general, the general public don't understand. And so when someone themselves is suffering or their loved one is suffering, it becomes a very much conversation about, why are you doing this? Well, this helps answer some of the why. It doesn't excuse a behavior. It doesn't excuse that somebody has mistreated somebody else, or that you're struggling, or that, it feels like the worst you've ever felt, but it helps you kind of understand the why behind it. And understand that they can get better, that there is hope, that this isn't just their destiny from here on out, that things can change. And so relying on the science and then relying on that relationship and that faith and that understanding with somebody can really help. Because it helps kind of remove them from getting so emotionally drained and invested, and understanding that this is a disease. And if we can frame it and model it and look at it in that way, just as if a loved one had any other disease, you want to be there for them emotionally and supporting and caring, but then you also need to understand what's happening in their course of treatment. You'd be asking them about what medications you're using, what does your doctor say, what else you need to do, what else is happening in your recovery in that process.
Your information is pretty much addressing the effect of drugs on the brain. In criminal justice, I've heard forever that than 90% of all crimes committed, people serving time are somehow connected to addiction.
That's true.
And there is, in academia and criminology, there's a push to where some folks think that if you would just legalize all illegal drugs, you would empty the prisons. And so, you know, Colorado and Washington State are starting to do that, legalize drugs, hoping that they'll prove themselves right, less people in prison. I like your opinion.
I think there is a line between legalization and decriminalization. So when we're looking at substances, not just I, but our agency and our work does not support full legalization. We've heard the stories, we've seen the studies in places like Portugal and other countries that have moved towards a legalization model. But what's missing for the United States is the healthcare piece. So while other places have attempted in legalization, they've also had full access to healthcare, full access to treatment. If we just legalize without those other social supports on the back end, people's behaviors are not going to change. People's structure and actions are not going to change. So what we would widely support is a move towards decriminalization, which means not just full legalization of substances, including marijuana, but looking at how do we better address problems related to substance use in the criminal justice system. That means that not incarcerating minority populations at disproportionate amounts. How do we build treatment infrastructure and social service resources so that we can divert people from entering into that system? Knowing that this is a progressive disease, we need more prevention and early intervention. When somebody is beginning to misuse substances or identifying signs and symptoms of other mental health disorders, intervening earlier to help divert them from entering into the criminal justice system to begin with. Or even further upstream, preventing those things from even having any onset. So looking at decriminalizing substances, looking at treating substances as a public health issue, not as a criminal justice issue, because that's what it is. It's a disease. We have it in a disease model. We have all of the information and science to understand it as a disease. Let's treat it as one. Let's treat it as a public health condition, not as a criminal justice condition. Again, there will be a subset of individuals who commit heinous crimes related, and they probably also have relation to substance use. It doesn't mean that all of their behaviors are excused, but again, we would be more focused on really looking at identifying people with a substance use disorder and diverting them into a public health treatment model, and then being able to better resource folks that might need criminal justice.
Now, what can parishes do?
I'm sorry.
What can churches do?
What can churches do? There's a lot of work, that churches can do on little scale and big scale. Some of the things I think you guys are already probably doing, at least I assume. I haven't taken a poll, but again, increasing conversation and education, reducing the shame and stigma that comes with substance use disorders. It's so prevalent. There is so much prejudice associated with substance use disorders that people are not willing and able to come forward and talk about it and being able to seek help. We have been starting to do a lot of work with local churches, even just in overdose education and naloxone distribution. And that helps give some education, but then helps give some resources and tools into people's hands, because overdoses happen to anyone, anywhere. And so being able to use those churches and those community hubs as a place that people can begin to have comfortable conversations and really start to look at how we can better address it, and then how we can have life-saving tools and measures in place as well.
What about resources for parents that have children that are struggling?
Same thing. There are a lot. NCDA. So one thing I didn't talk a lot about, but it's on our services here is we don't offer treatment, but we're able to stay connected to resources locally. I know that doesn't help all of you that are not from the St. Louis area, but there are other organizations like us in your communities, I'm certain. So being able to have those resources and connections, not that you have to have them all, but we have a treatment manual on our website, and in that we list local support groups for parents, local education programs for parents. We have a whole program that we call Talk About It, that is conversation kits for parents, starting as young as kindergarten. Our first one is K through 2, about that necessary, ongoing, frequent conversation with your children around substances, and it needs to start when they're the little ones. Again, I'm not sitting down with my kindergartner and talking about heroin. I'm talking about what's yummy and yucky things that you put into your body. Who are people that you can go to if you have questions about these kind of things? And then as they're getting older, what are my expectations and boundaries? Why I will support and understand if you make an unhealthy choice, because I understand that that might happen, but what can we do then? There's even talking kids through, if I suspect a teenager is using a substance, how do I engage in that conversation? So empowering parents, again, to not make this the scary, taboo, uncomfortable conversation and discussion, but a reality in our lives that addiction can happen to anyone.
You also gave a list of risk factors for substance abuse. And everything on that list is used in the courtroom when an accused person is about to be, whatever, found guilty or sentenced as a mitigating factor for guilt or for culpability for how much penalty, and all these things, victim of abuse, poor self-image, poor family relationships, and inability to cope with stress, which cause substance abuse. Attorneys use these every day to convince a jury that the substance abuse was necessary, and therefore the committing of the crime was beyond the person's control, and therefore their responsibility should be reduced. Again, maybe this is outside of your level, but I'd like your opinion on that, because that's every day, in every courtroom, this comes up.
Right. Ooh, so I don't think that, responsibility to be reduced is, people have to be held accountable. I mean, again, we have to have boundaries. We have to have the line that is able to be crossed. We have to be able to all function in society together.
Well, you called it earlier, you called this a disease.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the number one thing that attorneys like to harp on,
Right.
is it's a disease, which means that just the term itself causes a jury to think, oh, rats, Mr. Accused here, he's not so much that he's a criminal, but he's got a disease. And so that forever, I have not known exactly where I should fall on that. And with what you were saying, as we're here for the reason of trying to help folks.
Right. I would say we need to be better advocates of getting people treatment for their disease while we're also holding them accountable for their behaviors.
Right.
So if we had a person who had committed crimes or is now facing penalty in some way, and they have any other disease, we wouldn't be meshing those two things together. We would be saying, okay, yes, they're going to have consequences for their behaviors related to their actions, but we're also going to treat their disease, their hypertension, their cancer, their diabetes, just as examples of diseases. So when we're looking at substance use and we're identifying somebody has a substance use disorder, a disease of addiction, they have to be held accountable for their behavior, but we also have to have resources and systems in place to treat that disease as well. Or it's not, they can stay incarcerated for 10, 5, 15, 20 years, but we have done nothing to address the disease, the underlying root causes, the damage to their brain. So we have to be able to treat the disease and have boundaries
And by their incarceration, we've driven male people
Right.
into them because, it's us versus them. I'm the victim now.
Right.
So they could get into this victim mentality, and it gives them a much deeper hatred of themselves and of everything else. So yeah, it works against the whole treatment program. So
As a pastor and as a prison chaplain, everything on this list of risk factors comes up in counsel in my office. People that have problems, And all of them are turning to some of this stuff, either overeating food or nicotine or alcohol. And I would be scared to death to show them that chart because they would think that, oh boy, you know, if there's other things that can give me more relief. That's right. and so because they can't cope with that child sexual abuse or that poor family relationship or whatever, and so on. What's your thoughts on that?
Okay, it's all a matter of identity. You know, we identify with who we are, and as people that know that we have another identity in Christ, we come in and say, all right, you know, we need all these things. We need medicine. We need all of these things to live this life. But you know, when you're talking about substances, whether it be food that gives you pleasure, a friend of mine told me one time what's worth doing is overdo. You know, so we just tend to naturally go towards the pleasure center, and when that becomes toxic, our brain has been changed. And so, when as spiritual caregivers, we want that balance. You know, the things between food and medicine. When too much medicine becomes toxic, and then it takes over the brain, and it begins to kill the brain. So we need to kill that with baptism. You know, spiritually, we are being put to death daily, and so God is putting to death the things in us which cause all these imbalances, and we're able to walk upright with the Spirit of the Lord. You know, so the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He's the only one that can bring all these things into balance. And so that's what our church, that's what we go in to do. And then we need the treatment programs, and we also, you know, that they're doing something because there's this bottomless pit, you know, that cannot be filled with anything but Christ and God's love. So if you try to fill it up with anything else, it's going to cost you far more than it's going to give. So Jesus is the only thing that can pour himself into that and say, okay, you know, I forgive you now, I want to give you a sense of balance, a sense of using your gifts and talents to make healthy choices. Without the Spirit of God, we can't make healthy choices.
Thank you.
By the way, since I've been standing up and it's almost time to go, I just want to give another plug for Caring Connections. This is the article that I was asked to write, and because I work in the jail, I'm not a treatment counselor, I'm a chaplain. But as soon as I wrote this article, Jim Vet said, "Hey, you wrote an article on opioid addiction, right? Well, you must be an expert." I was more than happy. Jennifer, take the floor, because she truly is an expert on this. And my thing is just to listen and to live, to see where that bottomless pit is in their life. What is draining them and causing them to chase death? You know, and now I want to you know, deny yourself, pick up the cross, where Jesus says, has paid for all your past. Your past has been atoned for, and now follow Jesus. Follow him to use your gifts and talents to be a blessing to people, be a good neighbor, to be a husband to your spouse, or you know, a spouse, to be a father, be a good worker, be a good citizen. Follow Jesus and do life. So all these things. When they go beyond into the illegal realm, you know, you're outside. You know, that's what transgression means. You're out of bounds. You're not in the gift of life, right? You're playing the game with a different set of rules. You're not going by God's rules. So you want to stay following the shepherd, and that's where our spiritual as counselors, that's our part, in partners with the treatment and with the justice system. And we got to work together with the treatment counselors, with the first responders, with the people that, invite officers into your, and this is one of the, in my articles, what we can do. Invite officers, find out what drugs are out there. Because whatever people tell you is out there, it's not out there. So, if these criminals putting illegal drugs out there, they're trying to sell their wares. Most of them don't have any idea what they're selling. Because somewhere along the line, someone has put something else in there. And so it's Russian roulette, And even if they know what they're doing, some guys will come up and the dealers will say, hey, have you tried this fentanyl, Hey, 1 or 2 grams. It's cool, so they try it. And they're dead. And they can't, sometimes it's so powerful, they can't bring it back. There's doctors and there's witch doctors. The real terrorists out there are people that are promoting these illegal drugs, and they're witch doctors. They're practicing witchcraft, because witchcraft is going beyond prescription that brings healing. It's going towards toxicity and destroying yourself